On today's Fall Forward, we're speaking with Lord Tim Clement-Jones, sitting member of the House of Lords and digital and AI expert. Together, we explore the role of policy and regulation in unlocking AI, the impacts, threats, and opportunities AI will bring to society, and how he's led through change, balancing regulation and the need for innovation. Tim is at the cutting edge of AI policy change here in Europe, so make sure you tune in for this one. We're joined today by Tim Clement-Jones. Tim is a member of the House of Lords here in the United Kingdom, Tim, if I listed out all of the things that you've done and achieved in your career, I think we'd be here for most of the podcast, so I won't do that. But what I would love to do is perhaps, firstly, welcome you. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Very good to see you.
And secondly, I'd love to just give everyone a bit of an introduction to who you are, Tim, and kind of what's brought you to this place now where you're a bastion of digital, a bastion of AI, and obviously a sitting Lord in the House of Lords.
Well, it's a rather long and checkered but hybrid career. So, I started off really in politics at university. I supported the Conservatives in those days, but I was a very kind of wet conservative, and rapidly after university decided that the Liberals, as they were then, this was before the creation of the Liberal Democrats, were the right place to be. And we had some success in the 1974 election. At the same time, when Jeremy Thorpe was the leader, and at the same time, I was pursuing a double track, really, as a lawyer. So I trained in the city. I volunteered at the North Kensington Neighbourhood Law Centre, which really influenced my politics a huge amount. And I listened to Professor Ralph Darendorf's Reith lectures, all about the new liberty, life chances, and so on, which also very heavily impacted on my view about society, social mobility, and so on. So I've always had this kind of dual career. I qualified, I worked in a couple of law firms. I then went in-house because I'm an enthusiast. I believe in actually working closely with business and being part of a business structure, really. And I only came out of business when I left Kingfisher in 1995, I think it was, and then went into private practice, DLA Piper, really on the basis that I was doing something different. And I actually set up a government affairs operation within a law firm, which I always wanted to do. So it was a very attractive offer. And it was about the same time or just after that I came into the Lords. And I've now been there 25 years. And it's been an extraordinary time, really. I was health spokesman to start with. I was asked by Paddy Ashdown to come into the Lords on the basis of being the health spokesperson to take over from a rather splendid chain-smoking lady who was quite formidable, actually. So I took over from her. And then I became the creative industry spokesperson following that. And then as life in the creative industries became more digital, I realized that actually you really have to start wising up on the whole of the digital economy, on AI and so on. And I bumped into Stephen Metcalfe, MP, who sadly is no longer an MP. He was chair of the Science and Technology Committee. And this was back in 2016 at a technology breakfast, and we both decided that parliamentarians need to know a heck of a lot more about artificial intelligence. So we set up an all-party group, and that's now been going for 8 years. And as a result of being the co-chair of that group and the co-founder, I was asked to chair the AI Select Committee when it was set up in the House of Lords in 2017. So it's the same old story of one thing leading to another in life. You never quite know what's going to happen next. And so never close off the opportunities. And it's been a very interesting time. So, in a sense, I'm at my 50th the 50th year since my first general election. as an activist, so to speak, and I'm 25 years in the Lords. So it feels like we've come to a significant point, and I've published my first book on artificial intelligence earlier this year. So there are a few sort of landmarks that you feel, and I'm celebrating my 30th wedding anniversary. So, these things are all significant when you put them all together, basically.
Yeah, well, congratulations on the wedding anniversary, firstly. That's a milestone to be celebrated. And what an interesting few weeks for us from a politics perspective here in the UK. Our friends in America have got this ongoing and longer journey through to November for them. But for us, it's been an incredibly interesting few weeks. And we'll touch on that, I think, a little bit later on. I love you described your career of like this ongoing conversation or this ongoing movement for you. Something on your website really stuck out for me. It said, change starts with ideas and is achieved by actions. And it really stuck out for me. From our first conversation, Tim, you struck me as somebody who is keen to have a conversation to find the right ideas, but then keen to drive through to action. And you mentioned creating and setting up the APPG for AI. Talk to me about where does that come from in you as a person, Tim, in terms of you as a leader, and why is it important for you to drive change right now in the digital landscape here in the UK?
Well, it's really interesting that, because I think the first time that I realized that just talking about something was not going to get you anywhere without the action was the Cambridge Union. I worked, I was an undergraduate. We're all, if you've got a bit of the gift of the gab, you're always going to be attracted by something like the Cambridge Union. But I ultimately, I thought this is absolutely hopeless. All you do is stand up and debate. And so I thought, no, that's not for me. And I joined, and I became, I forget now, treasurer, secretary, whatever, of my college union, where you actually could do stuff. And I've always believed it's all very well to talk about it, but you've got to influence, you've got to be able to do things as well. So in parallel, with working in the Lords as a spokesperson, I chair a university still, because I believe that's really important. And it's it's a university devoted to social mobility. I also chair Trust Alliance Group, which delivers the energy and telecoms ombudsman, again, because I believe that you need to level the playing field. You need to have the ability to resolve complaints, to give redress to ordinary consumers, really important. So that's really why I went in-house as a lawyer, because just advising wasn't quite enough for me. I just want to make sure that people actually do what is the right thing and what is necessary to do. So, that's really why I'm in politics as well. Going to the Neighbourhood Law Centre way back in 1972, when I first was a young trainee solicitor, I thought, it's no good. It's all very well advising on housing. And this was the post-Rachman period when people were being evicted and with violence and so on and so forth. I thought, no, you've got to basically start changing the way that housing law works. You've got to actually change the law. So you've got to do it on a broader basis, a broader scale. So I've always wanted to combine those two things, ideas and action. And you're absolutely right to pick up on that. But one without the other is no good. It's all very well, sort of flapping around, taking action, but you've got to have the right ideas to start with.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Tim, for those of our members who are in the United States, we're kind of half in the US, half in the UK here. What does the House of Lords do? I'm conscious that they may not understand what the House of Lords is for, and perhaps before we talk about your book and the kind of the purpose of what you're trying to do from an AI perspective, it might make sense to just give them some context as to your last 25 years of sitting in the House of Lords and what that means from a political standpoint.
Well, if you like, we're like the kind of quality control of legislation, basically. I mean, we do interrogate ministers because we do have, we don't have separation of powers in the same way as the states do. So we do have ministers in both our houses who are subject to questioning. And of course, everybody in the states knows about prime minister's questions. Well, we have slightly less dramatic question times in the Lords, but they are quite forensic, and we do really try and get to grips. And we have a lot of experts, and it's not, after 25 years, you develop a certain amount of expertise. I'm a lawyer as well as everything else. So if things like intellectual property and data protection law, and other forms of regulation are really part of what I do. And so ministers, particularly if they're bright, new, bushy-tailed ministers, we need to make sure that they're held to account, and that's what we do. But the really important work is the quality control on the legislation. Now, by and large, in the Commons, they have what's called a guillotine, which means they rush through their legislation. They have a timetable. They have to deliver at all the different stages of a bill. And it's not very dissimilar to the way that Congress deals with these things, but they deal very quickly and they have very little debate. They pick out the key political issues and then more or less shove it down our end after a week or so, a couple of weeks, where we chew on this for quite some period of time. We've been around for a long time, so we can compare it to previous legislation. We also have had select committees quite often that have looked at the same issues. So we've got quite a lot of background in the policy making in this area. And, we basically try and improve it. And because the government never has a majority in the Lords, by and large, it means that if we put forward an amendment, and it's really an important one, we can carry that. So the government has to negotiate quite hard. Now, the one exception to that, and that's why the next year or so will be relatively quiet, I suspect, is where governments have put it in their manifesto, in their platform, basically, for the election. And that means that if they've done that, then we can't argue about the broad principle involved. We might argue about how it's implemented, but we don't push back too hard against things which have been put in a manifesto or what you might in the US call a platform.
Yeah, because of course that's the reason for them being in power, and therefore, yes, of course, makes sense. And I suppose this role of checking and the checks and balance that, of course, really important from a legislative point of view. It's easy for some to say on a Tuesday morning. I suppose it's very related to the reason we had an election in the first place. The recent data protection amendment bill was chucked out, and of course that was part of the process of calling the election and the like. So seeing that and seeing obviously GDPR and all of the push around data that's kind of been happening over the last few years. Talk to me then, Tim, about your book, Writing, Living with the Algorithm. It's delving into the complex challenges around AI governance and regulation and policy. Why did you write this book, sitting from the position that you're in? What inspired you to write it?
Well, it's a little bit part of the action agenda, basically, strangely enough, because you can make n number of speeches which are recorded in our what we call Hansard, which is the daily record of our debates. But, I always regard the House of Lords as a bit of a soundproof box, basically. It's all very well making speeches, however much you prepare them, you're still not necessarily getting to the audience that you want to get to. And I've been getting quite frustrated with our government's approach to AI regulation, focusing very much on the kind of the future existential risk, what is artificial general intelligence going to do, and also on the fact that it's all about AI safety rather than, what is important for the citizen as well, which is transparency, explainability, public benefit, freedom from bias, and so on. So I wanted a much bigger wrapper put around AI development in terms of regulation, not necessarily as as comprehensive as in the EU, because I'm a great believer in gap analysis. There's no point in kind of duplicating legislation if you can basically just pick out where AI is different and we need to regulate it. And I think that's very, very straightforward, actually. So that's why I wrote the book, because I thought, well, I put all these, it's all in speeches all over the place. So what effectively I did was gather all the material together, a lot of material from reports that we'd done in Parliament over a period, which again were gathering dust on shelves. I'm a great believer in never wasting a good report if possible. So I pulled all those off the shelf. And referred to them. And, I hope that the references are almost as useful as the actual text, because, time will change. But we need to build on the expertise, and the House of Lords and the House of Commons and their select committees, a bit like congressional inquiries, have some really useful conclusions that they've come to. And yet, governments quite often operate as if they're in a completely parallel universe, where the government is doing one thing or denies one thing, and yet select committees are coming to conclusions which are really, really sensible. So I do hope that we have a more evidence-based approach to public policy in this new government.
Within the book then, Tim, what were the biggest challenges for you in terms of articulating some of these critical issues? Because I think what you referenced there is a lack of understanding, probably, in the ministers in the government level through to select committees, who invariably are selected because of their expertise. So how did you kind of articulate some of those issues? What were those kind of key issues, and what do we then do about educating the broader set of both politicians and then also industry leaders to make sure that we're thinking about the right things?
Yes, I mean, first of all, you have to accept the fact this is not a potboiler. This is not, a book that is going to be, the general public is going to pick up and think, boy, I'm going to take this to the beach. I mean, you've got to realize that you're addressing, lawmakers, academics, civil servants, people who are going to have an influence over this stuff. And then what you need to do is tackle some of the issues head on. And I suppose the thing that I tackled most was this idea that regulation is the enemy of innovation. Because, governments are very good at sort of slogans. They talk about science superpower and all this kind of stuff. I wasn't going to address that too much, because my book isn't about the kinds of investment that needs to be made in AI. It doesn't talk about, it does talk about the opportunities, but frankly, industrial policy, it wasn't designed to tackle, but it was designed to tackle whether or not we needed to have some kind of regulation beyond data protection regulation for AI, and whether AI was sufficiently different from previous technologies to be regulated. So I had to tackle that, regulation is the enemy of innovation mantra, which is quite often used in sort of right of center circles, and some business circles too, although actually business is much more user friendly when you come to talk about regulation, because they want convergence of standards and consistency of uncertainty about the kind of regulation going forward. Otherwise, how can they invest with any degree of security that what they're putting into new technology is not going to fall foul of some future regime? So that's why that's so important. So I kind of try to go through and make the case, and I unpick also a number of publicly used technologies like live facial recognition, which in many parts of the States has actually been banned by cities, whereas we seem to be very gung-ho about the use of them. And also, there are areas of a considerable risk which have not yet been properly tackled, things like autonomous weapon systems, which are basically AI driven, where we really do have to get an international treaty of some kind in respect of those. So, it's unpacking the broad regulatory landscape, but also looking in detail at a number of other things like particular technologies, and also things like competition policy as well, antitrust, where, if you're not careful, you're going to have these big AI system developers, basically two or three maybe, absolutely dominating, just as software platforms like Apple and Google and so on dominate in the other part of the tech forest, so to speak.
Really interesting. You referenced there the kind of the big three, or what will be the big three or four, depending. We'll see what happens over the next couple of years. All of them have come out at some point and said there needs to be regulation, and that there needs to be, and of course you're referencing the point that they're investing heavily in this space, and they want to make sure that their investments are protected by doing so. I wonder whether AI has an opportunity to, because of the pace of change that's going to happen related to the technology here, whether, unlike a lot of policy movements that are quite or not as well received in industry because they're seen to be anti-innovation, whether this is actually one that could be the opposite, that actually is really well received. But the challenges, of course, are in complexity, aren't they? In that, as you referenced, I'd love to know, I suppose, when you were writing the book, some of those key areas that you thought, well, look, this is actually a really difficult. These are some of the really difficult principles or areas that actually, for us, we need to think about when we're guiding AI policy. I'd love to perhaps share some of those with the listeners a little bit.
Well, it's interesting because actually an awful lot of work has already been done. And I feel that some of the tech companies, there's a bit of St. Augustine about this, make me virtuous, but not yet. Oh Lord, I feel that that's, part of the approach. So yes, we'll go for voluntary guidelines and so on and so forth, but we're not ready. We don't know enough about AI systems to go for regulation. Well, I absolutely disagree with that. We've had AI ethical principles in place by the G20, by OECD since 2019. There's a very, very strong recognition of what those are, accountability, transparency, freedom from bias, public benefit, right to redress, and so on. So very, very clear sets of ethical principles, which, we need to translate into regulation and standards. Now, the big logjam is in the middle. Standards are being developed all the time. And the kind of standards that I'm thinking of are being developed all over the world in terms of risk assessment of systems, audit, training, testing standards, continuous monitoring, ethical design. They're all standards which are being developed by a number of different bodies. The International Standards Organization, IEEE, the engineers, by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the States. The issue there is how can we get them to converge and make sure we get a common international set of standards. The real, the bit in the middle actually isn't as important as the agreement on the ethical standards and the principles in the beginning. Of course, it would be nice if we could get a degree of convergence with Europe, if the states could have a degree of convergence through either litigation or congressional action, and likewise across the world. But, Australia, for instance, is being quite advertent to what's happening in Brussels and so on. But that is not actually the most important thing. The most important thing is business knowing and the public knowing in order to build public trust, because that's a key function, is the public and business knowing that new AI systems are going to adhere to these standards. So you don't need a great heavy touch. You need the risk assessment, and the EU Act, of course, you have a conformity assessment, but it's effectively the same thing.
Yeah.
And the good news is that the OECD is engaged in a major project trying to build convergence across these standards. And when you look at what the EU is doing following the passing of their AI Act earlier this year, they are determined to make sure that they're not reinventing the wheel on standards. So they're working with the OECD to find that common set of standards. So this idea that we can't keep up, regulation and standards can't keep up with the development of new technology, that, regulation's all too difficult, etc., is for the birds as far as I'm concerned. I'm a tech optimist, but I'm also a regulatory optimist.
Yeah.
And frankly, I've been regulating and legislating long enough to think that I know that it is possible. And of course, most recently, we've passed an Online Safety Act. And I think that's proof positive that it's difficult sometimes to get full agreement, but you can do it.
I think what's so lovely to hear you talk about there is that I think there's an appreciation that taking standards, that's speeding up process, isn't it? It's speeding up that move to get conformity around regulation and guidance around standards. That's changed for sure, though, hasn't it? That's not always been the case. So there is an appreciation from policymakers that actually there is a need to speed up in order to make sure that we can influence and implement policy and regulation that is for the here and now, not in 4 years' time. And that's definitely different.
Oh, absolutely. We've got a fantastic tribe, if you like, of AI experts. And, the One AI group of experts in the OECD is very instrumental in a lot of what's going on. We've got some great lawmakers in Brussels who, have been pretty tough in terms of getting it through. They had two committees all pulling in slightly different directions in Brussels as this was going through. It took quite a lot of work by the Commission to keep driving on. And of course, everybody's very anxious to try and get this level of agreement and conformity, and not be open to the accusation that we are stifling innovation in Europe and so on, because of course we don't have a Silicon Valley largely for historical reasons, but it's not because we don't we have the wrong kind of regulation, quite frankly. I think that's a myth.
And I suppose putting your House of Lords UK industry, UK hat on, I was over in the States and Canada a couple of weeks ago, and there's definitely a view and opinion that London has an opportunity here to be a real hub for AI globally because of its proximity to the EU regulation and policymakers, but also its slight distance from that and its closeness to America. Is that true in your opinion? Do you think there's a real opportunity for UK industry and for perhaps London in particular to become this global hub for AI?
Oh, absolutely. I hate hyperbolic language, so I'm not going to say, world beating or blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. But I would say that we have some of the best people in the world. People always talk about the Golden Triangle. Well, it's much, much wider than that. Edinburgh is a fantastic centre. But in London, the London universities and Cambridge and Oxford, of course, but Manchester, for instance, Heriot Watt, there are fantastic centres for AI development. And then, of course, we've got a growing and even, more and more important private equity, venture capital community as well, who are beginning to understand this stuff. We grumble a lot about the UK stock exchange, and we need to get the pipeline right. We know we don't have a sort of NASDAQ yet, but university spin-outs are beginning to really develop to a much greater degree. Universities are beginning to cooperate in terms of the way that they pull together private equity capital and cooperate with private equity firms and venture capital and so on. And, the Mansion House reforms in terms of pension funds and so on, that is going to, that kind of patient capital approach too, I think will have, potentially a big impact. But we've got to kind of, and I think a new government is the opportunity, and we've got no doubt a splendid debate on what's called the King's Speech, which is the government's programme in terms of the bills they want to introduce and so on, coming down the track. We've got a splendid debate coming, but I think one of the key things that you can't legislate for is unleashing what Keynes called animal spirits. With a new government, it's a chance for everybody to feel more optimistic, to feel more certainty about the future, to feel that the government isn't going to be chopping and changing legislation. And, the Prime Minister said that he's going to keep his ministers in post, for a decent period of time. I mean, one of the problems is quite often when you have a government like ours, you change ministers, senior cabinet ministers, and the policy changes.
Yes.
I mean, that's ridiculous. And you can't have tax breaks changing all the time. And then the unleashing of quite useful instruments like, the new National Investment Fund, which the Chancellor has launched quite recently. And then a National Wealth Fund, I should say, and then the British Business Bank, tying that in. So you're de-risking some of this tech investment, because there's no doubt our culture is more risk averse than the Silicon Valley culture. And therefore, what you do is you have to recognize that. So you've got to, compensate in many ways. And if we do that, and we unleash the expertise we've got, and we get that pipeline of commercialization and spin out right, half of our startups, our successful startups, come from university spin-outs. So it's a really, really important factor. And that again means research funding from government. Let's face it, the Americans absolutely taught us what to do with DARPA. An awful lot of American science and technology progress has come from public investment. It isn't, it isn't all Silicon Valley. The risk was taken by the public sector in America to start with, in many, many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an exciting message, isn't it, for us to be saying to leaders globally, is that, we're going to have some stability, or it feels like there may well be some stability now for a few years. So it's in a landscape of global still unrest politically in lots of places. Actually, this may be a place that's safe to put your investment, and a space full of very smart minds, which is exciting for the UK market. Looking ahead then, Tim, what do you envisage are some of the most significant challenges then for AI, and I suppose more interestingly then also the relationship with society, and what does that look like, and what could that mean? Because in the book you mentioned servant or master in the title, which intonates that there's an opportunity or a risk, or somebody's in control or not. And I'd love to get your view on what does that mean today, and what does that mean tomorrow in terms of some of the risks or the big challenges that we're going to see over the next few years.
Well, you'll notice that in the book I talk about digital skills and digital exclusion and digital literacy. All of those are really, really important. And if we're going to be able to harness AI in the right kind of a way, you need to understand what, as an ordinary consumer, if you like, the old saying that, when your data is being used, you are the product, basically. Well, people have to recognize when they are the product and recognize, when they need to protect their data, etc. All those kinds of aspects, reading the terms of and conditions, for heaven's sake, knowing where all this tech fits in terms of their lives. I mean, the Internet of Things is a classic example. How many people set a new password when they buy a doorbell, a new image recognition doorbell? Well, I reckon you could probably, count that as 1%, unless you're quite tech savvy. So all those kind of cybersecurity messages are really, really important as well. And then you come to the actual skills needed. Now, I'm a great believer in time, taking some time to upskill. I don't think we're going to have some job losses. Over the next 10 years, we're going to have job losses. We're going to have job opportunities. Probably the balance will be more job losses than opportunities. But then after a period of adjustment, I think then, new jobs will appear. And it's a bit like the horse. I mean, I always love versus the automobile. I always love that picture of Fifth Avenue in 1903, I think it was, versus Fifth Avenue in 1913. Fifth Avenue 1903, I think there's a single automobile. In 1913, you look at Fifth Avenue and there isn't a single horse and carriage, so that we have gone through changes before, and all those people who looked after horses, they became car mechanics and God knows what else. So we know it's possible to adjust. And of course, did the automobile create thousands, millions of new jobs? Absolutely. Huge changes to society. And we've got to basically be able to take the benefit, but we can only do it if we can upskill. And that isn't just people going to university or going to further education, in their teens or whatever. This is about upskilling people in mid-career.
Yeah.
And, one of the things we have all to realize is that, we may only be doing particular jobs for 5 years. We have to be more agile than we've ever been before in order to adjust to society. And I speak as a lawyer, and the legal sector, believe me, is going through a phenomenal change. A paralegal can now do what a fairly senior partner can do in terms of advisory work. They may not have the actual savvy and experience and judgment. That's something that comes with time. But in terms of the formal ability to advise on a particular piece of legislation or case law or whatever it may be, a paralegal now, with the use of some of the AI tools that are now available and pretty good, can do quite a lot, quite frankly. So this is bringing, the law to a whole new bunch of people, which they never had access to before because it was too expensive. So, this is going to be a really, really interesting development in just one profession. So think just how broadly, when you apply that to other professions and other jobs, it will be, people making up their own travel itineraries. What are travel agents going to do? I can put in now into an AI system, give me a travel itinerary. I'm going to be going for 2 weeks to Southeast Asia. Tell me the hot spots that I need to go to and how and what the best route is and what the best value airline is. And it'll come up with the answer probably in under 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's incredibly exciting. And I think it's about your viewpoint, isn't it? It could also be incredibly scary for people, depending on their, I suppose, their innate ability to see opportunity or risk. I think law is a great example of an industry that's going to be, and already is, as you mentioned, so hugely impacted. We've been talking on the podcast with the creative industry, of course, is the same, where you're able to ideate and make things happen that would have taken weeks and months for designers to create that are happening in seconds. That's scary for people. I know I was out in Canada a few weeks back listening to Jeff Hinton talk, and he's quite clear about the fear he has about AI. Do you subscribe to this idea that it's also scary? There's a risk around, if we don't have these policies and frameworks in place and standards, then there is a risk that there's a bigger existential risk from AI, or not? You don't think that's something we should be worried too much about?
Oh, I think there's dual risk. Jeff has come and talked to us in the Lords, and he was very cogent indeed. And his message is, I think, that there is both present and future risk. And by the way, the creative industries, and we haven't talked about those very much. One of my passions is creative industries, and we have to get the balance right here, so that our creatives, are able to benefit from the ingestion of their material, of their original content, their copyright content into these large language models. The move fast and break things culture of some of these AI developers has meant that they haven't paid a penny for some of the copyrighted material, and we've got to change that now. The horse has bolted to some extent, but we've got to have an absolute assertion of copyright, and we need to make sure that there is transparency of use by these large language models. Now, they can license it. It doesn't have to be wickedly expensive, but you need to acknowledge that other people's creativity needs reward. Otherwise we're going to have a society where artists, it's all a voluntary activity. There's no reward for being an artist. So, I mean, that can't be right. There's no incentive to be an artist. Do we really expect every form of music and art and dance and drama all to be free, for heaven's sake? I mean, that is complete nonsense. And so we've got to value creativity and make sure that does the right thing.
So is this an opportunity then for us as society to kind of...
Sorry, I didn't answer your question
That's all right.
on Jeff Hinton. I got carried away on the creative industry. Jeff is absolutely right. I mean, basically, of course, and you and I have talked about the need to regulate for the near term, but also, one of the reasons for regulating now, as opposed to leaving it till later, by the time we get artificial general intelligence or super intelligence, as Nick Bostrom coined it, it's going to be too late. Basically, super intelligence will be in charge. I mean, I'm a great believer in, great reader of William Gibson's books. And, well before the internet age, he was writing books like Neuromancer, the whole Sprawl trilogy. And, he conjured up a world of AI clouds, which effectively controlled us. Really, because of all the data that they had about everything, they were able to anticipate everything. They were able to control everything indirectly, even if they weren't embodied in robots or anything. So that is a possibility. And I don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we have super intelligence doing pretty much everything that a human can do without regulation, because how do we know that super intelligence is going to act for our benefit? And I do have a strong belief that actually humanity does have a future, should have a future, and we should regulate to make sure that it does.
Yeah, I hear. Couldn't agree with you more, Tim, on that one. One of the things that you talked about in the book, and you talk about and you've talked about a couple of times today, is the importance of bias, or managing or regulating for bias, which is actually innately a human thing, that we have bias in us. In fact, what we do here at Blend is intentionally celebrating the differences of leaders, right? The difference of your cognitive experience, where you've come from, everything that makes you who you are. We've already seen in the example you mentioned, the facial recognition. There's a great story about the African American lady in the US who just doesn't get picked up because the people who built the model just didn't train it on any data that was truly representative of who lives in the US. The role of bias in AI, how do we get that right? And more broadly for society, can the legislation and the approach we take from an AI perspective then manifest into a change in terms of how we deal with each other in the wider society? Do you think those conversations are linked?
Yes, I do. I completely, because I do. If you are able to test whether the data that you've got has inherent bias in it, and I don't deny it's a very difficult subject. Kate Crawford, who I've got a great deal of time for, has lectured on, bias and how difficult it is, because one person's bias might be another person's legitimate discrimination in terms of, quality or something or other. We all make choices. And the question is, when does a legitimate choice turn into bias that is detrimental to an individual or society? And making that judgment is very important. So when you test the data that you have that used for training, that is a really important standard that you have to adhere to. So, but I do believe that actually at the end of the day, it's possible, provided AI is more transparent, for it to be actually better at making predictions and choices free of that kind of human bias and prejudice, then that could be a better way of doing things. So we're not there yet, because I don't think we have a diverse enough group of AI developers, quite honestly.
Yes.
Tech bros are not the best people to spot bias, quite honestly. And we need to have that diversity. We're not there yet. And so there's a lot, and I mentioned that in the book too, there's a lot about this kind of area that we need to get right before we can have full confidence that these systems are unbiased, so to speak, difficult though that concept may be.
Yeah, I would also agree with you there, Tim. And I think um, the only thing I would perhaps highlight is this idea of cognitive diversity within that conversation, because it's not always about what you look like or where you come from, how you identify. It's actually how you think. That's the uniqueness that we need to celebrate in this.
Absolutely. But even amongst tech bros, I'm not entirely sure that there's a lot of cognitive diversity.
No.
Not if it's all move fast and break things in that sense. The other aspect of this, of course, is that you've got to have enough transparency for people to be able to challenge decisions. So, and you've got to have the right to redress. So this isn't just all about the testing and training and spotting the bias in the data sets that are ingested, so to speak. It is about having enough transparency and explainability at the back end of the outputs to make sure that the ordinary citizen or subject or whatever we like to call them basically have the right to challenge.
I love that you said that, because that was literally going to be my next question. Because your role in the ombudsman and also from a legislative and policy making perspective is often what you've talked about is celebrating the failure to learn from it. And creating a space or a forum with which to share that. The theme of our podcast is Fall Forward, right? So it's all about how do we highlight and share the learning. So I'd love perhaps to ask you then, Tim, to share something from either your career or as you've gone through this process of writing a book around AI. What is I suppose the lesson or the failure that you would share with our leaders around the world that perhaps might help them to think differently about what they're doing, or could be from your career, could be from as the process that you went through from writing the book?
Well, I think you've got to be open to new ideas. I mean, I must keep the book trade fairly busy, because I obviously I've written a book, but I've read a huge amount, and people like Stuart Russell's Human Compatible, Brian Christian's book, The Alignment Problem, things like that are really influential. And I take great a recent book by Verity Harding. There are some really interesting, and they influence you. And I think that actually the absorption of ideas by politicians is really important. You can't just suddenly arrive fully armed and know all the answers. So I'm very much hoping that, again, and this government has indicated that it doesn't have a monopoly of wisdom. It has, now every government, I suspect, arrives with a degree of humility, and then the humility disappears after a few years. I've been through a few cycles like that. But I'm hoping that we might buck the trend this time around and really have a government that will take on board ideas and so on. But, it's just that you've got to continuously learn. And, my great friend, my former leader, Paddy Ashdown, he always, when he became leader, the first thing he did was sort of work out where he needed to develop. And he realized that he needed to develop his speaking and presentation skills, and and he was always learning. He went on a tour when he became leader, around the country, just absorbing different cultures. Down in Cornwall with a fisherman, and up in Scotland, and basically he made it his business to try and get under the skin of life across the UK. So he was always learning, and my goodness me, right up to the moment of his demise. He was a geek. He was a tech, and you don't imagine that somebody, in their late 70s is going to, develop those kinds of skills. But that's what I would emulate amongst politicians, basically.
What great advice. Always be learning. Get out there and expose yourself to ideas and challenge yourself to accept different points of view. And then in turn, that bias will start to change that role of bias, won't we, of course, by doing that,
Well, we're all
which
the
is great.
victims of our upbringing to a large extent. I mean, look, I chair a university which is incredibly diverse in its student population, and I'm in no way representative as the chair of it. But I would hope that over life, I've absorbed enough and I've lived enough to understand the experience, even if I didn't have it myself, of a lot of our undergraduates. There's a thing about empathy. There's a thing about understanding, which I think we need to develop, and you can only do that by making sure that you're intellectually learning, but you're also emotionally learning as well.
Is there a risk then with the AI for younger generations that they miss that opportunity to learn because they're presented with the answer? And so you mentioned earlier about the role of a paralegal versus a partner. There's a reason that the partner is able to give advice. It's because of the experience and the learned behavior, the falling over, the failures of years and years and years and seeing things. Is that a risk to the younger generations that they're being asked to then make decisions on things that they don't fully understand because they are just presented with information and they're presuming that it's correct?
Absolutely. It's one of the most difficult things. This kind of training uh, uh, abyss, which is going to build up, because how do you get that training experience when basically AI is giving you all the info? You aren't sitting there necessarily with a partner who is dealing with it. So I think you've got to actually think through how you substitute for that. And AR and VR for me are increasingly going to have to be used, where you almost experience it through VR and AR, which through constructs, deliberately designed scenarios and so on, because you're not going to get it in real life. But it's as near as, damn it. And I think that it is possible, but we're not thinking nearly enough about what we need to do, because there's no substitute for failure in some respects. I'm a great believer in learning from your mistakes. And if you're never allowed to make mistakes because AI does it for you, and the one of the big dangers which people never talk about, the biggest risk of all, more than bias, more than lack of explainability, more than many other risks involved in AI, it is the whole question of overdependence. If you depend overly much on AI, you may be de-skilling yourself over a period of time. Now, that is quite worrying. In fact, people in their teens, if they are already starting to rely on AI, may find that they don't have the skills that they need in terms of analysis or précis or summary or whatever it may be. Now, it makes me sound like a sort of some old talking about the pocket calculator, but this actually is much more significant and important because of the versatility of AI. So we have to get round that and make sure. I mean, you've seen this whole movement for people leaving their smartphones in a locker at school.
Yes.
Well, that's part of it basically. And I think schools, although creatively, I really think they should use AI in the education process, need to be aware of the overdependence potentially of students on it.
You've inspired me to think about a particular area, Tim, which I will come back with you another time, I'm sure. But one of the things that we do on the podcast is we always ask our members to give a question to the upcoming guests. And so our question is, with your experience and current viewpoint from an AI perspective, what advice would you give to a leader in large organizations to ensure that their teams and business are well prepared?
Well, anticipate legislation and look at where we are as far as standards are concerned. So look at from the corporate governance point of view, look at the principles, the OECD principles, take responsibility at a senior level. You need a main board director, effectively a senior vice president or somebody at the very top level, making sure you've got the right corporate governance in terms of A, taking opportunities, B, mitigating risks. And then in terms of the workflow, the work stream that you want to set up to make sure that you are getting your governance right, you need to then start looking at what standards are out there. And when you either procure AI systems yourself or you actually develop them yourself, you make sure that you are adhering to those standards.
Sounds like a very challenging time for leaders over the next few years, but I suppose getting out and having conversations and reading and exposing yourselves to different ideas. And I think, Tim, the wonderful thing about your book is you're making governance and AI accessible to people who perhaps, like myself, wouldn't spend as much time in that. So thank you for that. And I've enjoyed the book already, and I think it's definitely something over time which will be interesting to read again to see how things progress, which will be exciting. So thank you for that. We always finish our podcast, Tim, with a request from our guests to share with us a piece of advice, a recommendation, something that perhaps you would share with our members or our listeners, something that is important to you. It could be professional, it could be personal, something that you would recommend to people to do or be mindful of. And that could be anything. We've had walking, books, all sorts of different stuff. But I thought we'd ask you the question. What would you recommend to our listeners?
A very old friend of mine, sadly deceased now, who I used to work with at a major company, Kingfisher, always said, you've always got to engage the opposition. Now, what that means is you don't just simply sit around with people who agree with you. What you've got to do is find out, why people have an entirely opposite position to yours, and that can be in business. This was in connection with Sunday trading, where we wanted to find out why there was such a big objection to us opening our stores on Sundays. And so we engaged with religious groups. It was really important to us that we talked to them. But the same is true in politics. I've always wanted to make sure that I understood the opposition point of view, and it could be true of competition in business. It could be true of entirely different academic standpoints. But I think understanding the polar opposite to you is really important. And sometimes you do find they've got some good points. They're well rooted in their communities, and you may find that there's a grain of truth in what they're talking.
What wonderful advice, Tim, and resonates so closely with our heart and our mission here at Blend about accessing ideas that are different to yours and challenging yourself to think differently, because it's innately hard for us as humans to do that, isn't it? And but if we do, then and
it's the social media algorithm that almost prevents us from doing so.
Yeah, it does, and that's an acceleration, isn't it, of perhaps what we saw in the papers in the 80s and the 90s, and now into social media, where it's very much what you see and consume is your choice. Well, not your choice, because the algorithm's doing it for you, but it makes it feel, at least it is, your choice. Tim, thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. I've found this really interesting conversation, so thank you so much for giving us your time and joining with us on the Fall Forward podcast. We wish you well in what's going to be an exciting few months with our new government coming in. Lots of new exciting policies and conversations to review and to debate and discuss. And I know our members in London are looking forward to seeing you in September when we host you at one of our live sessions as well. So we're really looking forward to having a conversation with you then. And we wish you well over the summer. Hopefully we'll have some sunshine, Tim, but thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Thank you. That was a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim. Make sure you subscribe to the Fall Forward channel so you don't miss any new episodes. I'll see you soon.